Hey guys, welcome to the next installment here in our video lectures, and today we're going to wrap up the second part of our industrialization PowerPoint, the stuff that we did not get to in class. And if we think back to what we talked about on Monday, was that we really kind of established where the industry was coming from as far as our ROSE acronym, because of railroads and because of oil and because of steel and because of electricity, that the Americans are able to really kind of take over from England as the largest industrial power in the world, and that the economy really starts to rise with the likes of people like Andrew Carnegie and people like Henry Ford and people like Thomas Edison and people like Vanderbilt. And we saw kind of the transformation of the industrialization in the different regions, whether it was the North, the South, or the West. Well, today we're just going to kind of pick up where we left off with and kind of recap everything from Monday's discussions in class. If you think back to, we left off here with Andrew Carnegie, and we started reading Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, which we will finish up in on Wednesday as well. But with the idea of the different tycoons or the different industrial powers, like the Carnegies or the Rockefellers, we really want to kind of put ourselves in the right framework. And we want to be thinking about the different terms that we talked about in class on Monday, as far as laissez-faire, the invisible hand, supply and demand, and so forth. So make sure you're good on those terms, and also the idea of social Darwinism, which we'll talk about here again in just a second. So much like how Carnegie was kind of the monopolist of the steel industry, we think of John D. Rockefeller as the oil tycoon. And this is creating there's a huge demand for oil for multiple factors, even before the first automobiles and industrialization in those capacities, just as far as lighting, as far as kerosene, as far as just being able to heat your homes as well. So Rockefeller is able to kind of really get a niche into the oil companies, because there is a huge demand for the product. So with Rockefeller's oil company, his Standard Oil Company, he's kind of known for someone being very ruthless businessman, somebody who would use ruthless tactics to buy out competing companies. And by doing this, he was able to allow for lower costs and improving the quality of products with the oil. So the oil was getting more reliable and better product. And he's also, by in 1879, have almost a true monopoly. And that's a good word to make sure that we know monopoly. Think of it kind of like the game Monopoly. The goal of it is to buy up all the board and to have nobody else have any money in the game. Same thing holds true here in a real life monopoly. A monopoly is somebody or a business who owns 100% of the market share. So somebody who controls and manufactures 100% of a certain product. So even though that Rockefeller is not a true monopoly, as we can see he gets up to 90%, is very, very close to making that true monopoly. Now, part of the problems with monopolies, as we'll see as we get into our next unit with the progressive era, but a little foreshadowing here, is that if you have a true monopoly, it allows for the concept of price gouging for supply. So if you are the only person who creates oil, you really get to kind of decide how much price there will be, because there is no competition. Capitalism thrives, supply and demand thrives, the consumer thrives when there is competition. Think of it kind of like Coke and Pepsi, where because Coke and Pepsi are competing for your dollar, it makes Soda One better and it makes it cheaper for the consumer. If there was no Coke, or if there was no Pepsi and there was only one, that company could basically price whatever they wanted to, or they could charge whatever they wanted to for soda, because if you wanted to buy it, you would have to pay it. So much like the other of these tycoons, sometimes you hear the word called robber barons, kind of using it as a negative connotation for these businessmen. Rockefeller is someone who we kind of think of as somebody who uses his power to influence laws in Congress and to really kind of make sure that his businesses are able to thrive in the through the national government. But we kind of think of them as both for some negative, but also for positives. As far as the philanthropy, very much like Carnegie, giving away millions and millions of dollars for certain foundations and certain projects and so forth for the charitable. Think about, again, that social Darwinism factor, that gospel of wealth, that is the rich's obligation to help out the less fortunate. Now, because there is so much more of a rise in economic and the big boom in the economy, and people are gaining wealth very, very quickly, there is a huge rise in the need for financing, because as business gets larger, they need to have people to be able to handle their finances and so forth. And one of the major industrial people in this sector of the market will be J.P. Morgan, which is where we get the name for the company today that does work on people's finances, whether personal or business or tax, or doing your taxes and so forth. And by having so much influence and by having so much capital, that he was really able to take care of Vanderbilt's railroad industry. When railroad companies or individual railroad companies might be struggling, they were able to kind of bail them out. Think about how in your lifetime we have seen, like in 2008 when the housing crisis took place, the different banks were bailed out by the federal government. Same kind of thing here. And this is able actually to help kind of ease the tensions or ease the depression that is of the Panic of 1907. So even though we think of this time period as being a huge rise and a big boom, think kind of like the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, that is not always the case. There is constantly the economy is moving up and moving down, just like it does today, where we have periods of growth, time periods of recession, time periods of stagnation, and so forth. This was the case in 1907 as well. So one of the big key concepts to keep in mind here is that industrialists like these guys that we just mentioned, these tycoons or these philanthropists or these robber barons, however, whatever word you want to use to describe them, they're really going to kind of change the way that businesses are organized, as far as having different levels of management. Because before this, there had never been a company so large that you needed this. And with them changing the way that businesses are being run, it allows for them to, one, employ many more people. So there's a huge job market during this time period. It improves efficiency, which always lowers costs for products, which allows people to their purchasing power to go up. Because even though you might be making the same amount of money, if things are now cheaper, you're able to buy more goods. And one of the things that makes it kind of interesting with how these holding companies are going to work, or as these larger corporations grow, that the development of these corporations changes. And kind of an analogy of how businesses might work in this time period, think of it kind of like in media. So let's use a company like NBC as a example. So NBC might be your holding company, and they're a very large company. They oversee many different smaller companies underneath them. So even though NBC is a TV channel, they might also have TV, they might have radio, they might have print media, and they each have their own subsidiary companies that kind of work underneath them as well. So let's just focus on let's say their TV company. So in company A here, with NBC, NBC itself is a channel, so they would have their own company here, but then NBC also controls, like, let's say USA and Bravo and other channels that are all kind of under the same umbrella of NBC. So it kind of is a breakdown of how these companies are organized. And again, it allows for larger efficiency, better products, cheaper products, and better consumer purchasing powers. And another thing that's going to kind of create them to be a little bit more efficient or to be able to move more organized is going to be this idea of creating trusts, or kind of like a board of trustees. And these trusts are these formations of people kind of coming together and kind of controlling the companies even across different state lines. And it's important to think about is that for a lot of this time period in this Gilded Age, it was very difficult to do business across different state lines. So let's just use an example like Walmart. Even though Walmart is a company based out of Arkansas, it would have been very difficult for them to do businesses or to control business in other states like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and other states outside of their area, for a number of reasons, whether it would be for transportation and of goods and so forth, or even just state laws that would make it. So these trusts that, and Rockefeller was one of the ones who was very known for using this. These trusts were kind of a way to kind of organize and have a set of stockholders really kind of manage across state lines and really kind of allow for the company to grow, or at least to have kind of a basis for an infrastructure at the top as far as management goes. Another tactic that's going to be very prominent during this time period is the idea of mergers. And mergers is very simple. It's when more than one company merges together. We see this all the time, even still today. But it is a very heightened idea at this point because you have a lot more smaller industries. Well, if we're merging companies together, they're able to make them a little bit more efficient, allow for, again, for the cheaper products and cheaper goods for the consumer. And this is kind of where John Rockefeller will come in with his Standard Oil. By buying out competitions, it allows for there to be less for buying out other companies, it allows for less competition, but it allows for him to kind of standardize the price and the production of oil. A really good modern day example of this would be the merger that took place between AT&T and DirecTV. If you pay attention to commercials and so forth, or if you ever read articles about this in business media, that the two companies who were very separate, and obviously they have two different industries, one being in telecommunications with cell phone services, and the other being within satellite television. When DirecTV and AT&T merged together, they're doing so to increase profits. And what you see is that for the consumer wise, that you have now you start to have deals being made to kind of give you more bang for your buck. So oftentimes, if you see this in commercials, a lot of times either one way or the other, they'll talk about how if you have a AT&T plan that you can get certain channels on DirecTV for free or certain plans on DirecTV for cheaper, or vice versa, where if you have DirecTV, you might be able to get your cell phone bill for cheaper, or you might be able to get certain perks with your DirecTV plan. This would be an example of how mergers kind of work together to increase profits for the consumer, but also for themselves as well. So, one of our next concepts here we're going to talk about is the idea of horizontal and vertical integration, because these are the two business ideas that are going to be used to do two things. One, reduce competition within industry, and also to increase profits and to reduce costs. So, let's use horizontal integration first. And we're going to use Rockefeller Standard Oil as an example because he was known for his horizontal integration to create almost a monopoly, like we talked about earlier, having a 90% share in the marketplace. And Standard Oil, what they were best known for was the refining. So if we're talking about just producing oil, so how does oil come from the ground to getting in a can for you to purchase? It would be taking through these general stages of introduction or production. I'm sorry. It would start with the drilling, and then you would drill it out of the ground. Transportation of how you get it from the mill to the refineries, and then the idea of refining, getting it from the crude oil, the black stuff that you get out of the ground, to the product that you want to create, whether it's kerosene, gasoline, whatever you want to use it for, and then also the sales part of it. Well, what Rockefeller does is he buys out almost all of the refining factories. So every single refining factory, for the most part, we'll talk about up to 90%, was owned by Standard Oil. Now, what that allows for you to do is to, one, make it homogenous to where it's all being done the same way. It makes it more efficient. It makes it cheaper. It allows for less competition, so that way you're able to maximize profits because almost everybody is buying oil from your company. So this is an idea of horizontal integration. You can see the reason why we call it that, because it goes through just one of the stages of production. A modern day example of this might be, let's say, as far as postal services. And if you want to send a letter, let's say that the only company that you could go through would be UPS. So for any kind of mail service or any sort of transportation service for products or so forth, whether it be packages or mail or bills or letters, whatever it might be, you had to go through UPS. There was no FedEx, there was no National Postal Service or Federal Postal Service. All you had was that one option. Okay, so that is the idea of horizontal integration. Now let's go ahead and look at vertical integration. So Carnegie Steel is going to be very popularized for creating what's called vertical integration. Now, vertical integration is where you control an entire stage of production from beginning to end. Okay, and you can see here that in Carnegie Steel, they not only controlled the mining part, the transportation part, the smelting or the creation of the steel, and then the refining and rolling of it as well. So by doing all of these parts, then you're able to cut out the middlemen. Okay, so you don't have to pay somebody to do it for you, and you're able to maximize your profits through that and lower your prices to the consumer. So this is what makes Carnegie Steel so much more efficient than other companies. So if we kind of put it into modern day examples, a good modern day example is, let's use coffee, and we'll use Starbucks as an example. So let's say that Starbucks practices vertical integration. So instead of obviously having mining, the first step might be picking. The coffee beans and stuff coming from South America, they would control that. And then the transportation part, where they get it back to the United States, they would control that as well, via trade from whether Colombia or Venezuela or wherever they're getting their beans from. And then maybe they control the packaging, the manufacturing and packaging of taking it from the bean and making it into the grounds or whatever product they're making. And then also the retail, where you actually would go to a store and you would buy a cup of coffee or whatever you would like from them. But by doing that, they're able to control all parts. They're able to cut out all middlemen, so that way they can save money, and they're able to get your cup of coffee at a cheaper price than it would be even so if they had to go through other middlemen.